2 weeks ago, on the Shabbat before Pesach, I spoke about 3 communities and 3 calendars, and the diverse celebrations that were actually occurred in various stages throughout those 14 days between the beginning of Pesach and yesterday. During that talk, I also mentioned the 20th of April as being the day of Bikkurim and the beginning of the 50-day countdown to Shavuot. That is the period of the counting of the Omer. Today, I want to explain how we, as Talmidim of Yeshua, establish the date for celebrating Bikkurim. That is, by following the Aviv Calendar. Now, many people in the 21st century Messianic community, along with the rabbinical Judaism, celebrate Bikkurim 2 days earlier. That is because they base the event on the Hillel calendar, along with the teachings of Talmud, in preference to the words of Torah and the Brit Hadashah. So let's look at Bikkurim, which is also known as first fruits. Bikkurim is an important day in the scriptural calendar because it is the third of the 7 Moedim found in Leviticus chapter 23. And looking at verses 9 through 11, we are told, Yahweh said to Moshe, "Tell the people of Israel, after you enter the land I am giving you, you are to harvest the ripe crops, and you are to bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the Cohen. He is to wave the sheaf before Yahweh, so that you will be accepted. The Cohen is to wave it on the day after Shabbat." As the Talmidim of Yeshua, we consider those words are just as important today as they were when Yahweh gave them to Moshe. That is why we want to celebrate Bikkurim on the right day of the year in a manner that is pleasing to Yahweh. Now, having said that, we also acknowledge that in the absence of the temple, it is impossible to observe Bikkurim in the same way as it was observed during the first century. We no longer need a Cohen to wave the sheaf because on our behalf, Yeshua ascended to his Father on the day of Bikkurim, as we read in John chapter 20. We also acknowledge that it was the day after his resurrection. During his ascension on Bikkurim, Yeshua was given all authority by his Father in heaven and on earth. Even though he has not as yet exercised full authority on earth, we accept that when he returns, he will bind Satan and rule unhindered for 1,000 years. So we deem it a privilege to know the sovereign plan of God, and that his fulfillment of the third Moed, Bikkurim, is an indication that he will fulfill the last 3 of the Moedim at the time of his return. As Leviticus chapter 23 verse 11 says, because the Cohen waved the sheaf of grain, Yahweh accepted the people of Israel. In the same way, we as Talmidim of Yeshua, by observing Bikkurim, will be acceptable to Yahweh. So it is important that we observe Bikkurim on the correct day. But how can we determine which day is correct? By going back to verses 9 to 11, we see that it refers to the sheaf of first fruits being waved on the day after the Shabbat. But it does not say which Shabbat was being considered. However, what we do know is that it was a sheaf of barley, because the words that follow in verses 15 through 17 give us an indication of the fact that it was the beginning of the count of the Omer. And those words are, from the day after the day of rest, that is, from the day you bring the sheaf for waving, you are to count 7 full weeks until the day after the 7th week. You are to count 50 days. And then you are to present a new grain offering to Yahweh. you must bring bread from your homes for waving, 2 loaves made with 1 gallon of fine flour, baked with leaven, as first fruits for Yahweh. As the barley is harvested in early spring, straight after Pesach, and the wheat is not harvested until the beginning of summer, 50 days later, we can be assured that the sheaf that was being waved was the barley one. But neither of these portions of Leviticus 23 tell us exactly which day the sheaf was waved. In the complete Jewish Bible, verse 11 says it was on the day after the Shabbat, while in verse 15 it says the day after the day of rest. Now the same Hebrew word is used for both days, both for rest and for Shabbat. So, which one is correct? The context suggests from the underlying Hebrew word that it is actually referring to Shabbat. So let's dig a little deeper into the history of Judaism and see what we can find. There are well-documented and complex arguments that have been put forward by the Jewish sages of old and later generations of commentators, which have debated whether the verses should be read as after the Shabbat or after the day of rest. Tiresome as that may sound, it is important to get it right, because it determines the actual day on which Bikkurim is to be celebrated and when the count of the Omer must begin. Commenting on verse 11, Rashi was quoted in the Sephra, that is, the Halak Midrash on the book of Leviticus, by saying, on the morrow of the day of rest, that is, the morrow of the first day of Pesach, which is called a day of rest, because ordinary work is forbidden on it. Although the word ordinarily refers to the Shabbat, this cannot be the case here, because the verse does not specify which of the 52 Shabbats is meant. Now, putting all that into simple 21st century language, Rashi basically favors the day after the day of rest, because it could be conveniently placed immediately after the day of Pesach. Another commentary from the Talmud says in Tractate Menachot 65a, regarding verse 11, says, the term, the day of rest, became one of the major points of controversy between the sages and the heretical Boethicians, or Sadducees, who interpreted the term literally, referring to the Shabbat, thus claiming that the Omer had to be brought on the Sunday following the Shabbat. Now that controversy occurred between the Perishim, or the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, or the Sadducees, during the 1st century CE. And it came about because both parties at that stage were following the Aviv Calendar. It was not until about 300 years after the destruction of the Second Temple that Rabbinical Judaism abandoned the Aviv Calendar in favor of the Hillel Calendar. However, it's against that background that the Hillel Calendar, that Rashi offers his comments, which were given around about 1070 or 1100 CE. That's well after Rabbinical Judaism had adopted the Hillel Calendar. Clearly, by embracing the Hillel Calendar, and later the teachings of Rashi, Rabbinical Judaism have regrettably, and much of the modern Messianic community as well, hold to the belief that Bikkurim falls on the day after Pesach, or that is, the second day of Matzah. Having adopted that line of reasoning, both Rabbinical Judaism and most of the 21st century Messianic community celebrate Bikkurim 2 days ahead of when it falls in the Aviv calendar. What about Christianity? Having considered how the Rabbinical Judaism established its date, the date on which to celebrate Bikkurim, it is now time to consider the Christian perspective of that same event. Just as the first century Purushim were founders of the rabbinical Judaism, so also the first century Messianic community were forerunners of Christianity. However, most Christians will say that their community existed from the time of Yeshua's ministry onwards, a claim that is patently untrue, because throughout the 40 years between the death and resurrection of Yeshua, the first century Messianic community grew exponentially through initially being all Jewish. It was only by invitation that the Gentiles came in later. However, following the calling of Cornelius, the Roman centurion, through the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, the numbers of Gentiles that were called by the Ruach HaKodesh increased alongside the number of their Jewish brothers. Finally, following the destruction of the temple, there was a progressive move away from things Jewish. The Messianic community became overpowered by Gentiles, who became more and more determined to distance themselves from anything Jewish. Hence, in the latter part of the 2nd century CE, the community underwent a total reset and started its journey towards becoming the Roman Church. The transforming reset finally was confirmed and established by Emperor Constantine, who convened the Nicene Council of Bishops in 325 CE. It was at that first meeting of the Council of Nicaea that they discussed and established the keeping of Easter, and that was confirmed and established for the whole of the Roman Church. A letter was later found among the writings of Eusebius on the life of Constantine. And in that letter, from the emperor to the bishops who had not been present at that first council, we read part of an excerpt from the opening paragraph where it says, "When the question relative to the sacred festival of Easter arose, it was universally thought that it would be convenient that all should keep the feast on one day. For what could be more beautiful and more desirable than to see this festival, through which we receive the hope of immortality, celebrated by all with one accord in the same manner? It was declared to be particularly unworthy of this, the holiest of festivals, to follow the customs and calculations of the Jews, who had soiled their hands with the most fearful crimes and whose minds have been blinded." So the die was cast. The first century Messianic community had been reconstituted as a new religious institution and finally severed all its ties with its Jewish roots. Having adhered firstly to the Julian calendar and latterly to the Gregorian calendar, the churches of Christendom distorted both the timing and the purpose of the celebration of Bikkurim. Having divorced themselves from all things Jewish, they also divorced themselves from things from Torah. The 7 Moedim no longer meant anything amidst the pagan festivals that had been adopted, and Shabbat was moved to Sunday, the first day of the week. They even went so far as to replace the name that God had given the Messiah of the Scriptures with a Greek alternative. Further, by placing the resurrection of Jesus Christ on Easter Sunday, in accordance with the dictates of the Nicene Council, it became a direct distortion of the scriptural narrative, both in the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah. Both rabbinical Judaism and the Christian community opted to ignore completely the sign of Yonah, which Yeshua himself gave to the Purushim and the Torah teachers during his ministry. Both ignored his words and instead went on their own way, with rabbinical Judaism denying the messiahship of Yeshua, and the Christian church reducing the time that he was in the tomb to 1 day and 2 nights, simply because the sign of Yonah did not fit with their doctrinal agenda. We have also seen that during the Nicene Council of 325 CE, the Roman Church confirmed their denial of the true scriptural narrative by replacing the words of the Torah and the prophets with their own man-made doctrines. So what about Yeshua HaMashiach? Despite all those man-made changes, there still remained one way to determine when each event should occur in 30 CE, and that is by following the Aviv Calendar. Through that calendar alone, we can see a clear pathway through all the events that Yeshua endured through that important month of Aviv. That's the first month of the year. The whole process has been summarized in our webpage in the form of 3 charts in the essay entitled Sign of Yonah. It can be found on www.messianic.org.nz. It is impossible to determine just exactly when Rashi first adopted the 16th day of Nisan for the day of Bikkurim. However, Rashi certainly appears to have had a profound effect on that choice. But does it really matter? This is a phrase that is often used by many people in both the 21st century Messianic community and the churches of Christendom, with many preferring individualistic approach to the whole matter of religious expression. It is often said that the Jews keep the Torah and Shabbat and let the Gentiles observe the 4 Noahic laws. That's all that's required. Did it really matter that Christians believe that Jesus Christ died on Good Friday and rose on the Sunday morning? The reason often given for the great deal of indifference towards the scriptural narrative is that the most important thing is to love one another and accept each other's differences. My response to that type of rhetoric is to draw people back to Leviticus chapter 23, where Yahweh spoke to Israel and said in verse 11, when instructing the Cohen how to wave the sheath so that you will be accepted. He meant not only the Cohen would be accepted, but the whole of Israel. Do the 21st century Messianic community and Christendom also want to be accepted by Yeshua? The answer must be yes. One question we need to consider carefully is which is more important, to do what Yahweh wants and being accepted by Him, or doing what pleases our fellow men? What did Yeshua say on the matter during his ministry? In Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23, we read, "Not everyone who says, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only those who do what my Father in heaven wants. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we expel demons in your name? Didn't we perform miracles in your name?' Then I will tell them to their faces, 'I never knew you. Get away from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" Who wants to find themselves among those who are asking those questions and receiving that answer? It's a sobering thought, straight from the mouth of the Master himself. Just as I said 2 weeks ago, Yahweh used the forces of Babylon to destroy the first temple. He used the forces of Rome to destroy the second temple. And soon Yeshua will return as the conquering king. And he, along with his army of angels, will destroy all the nations. So we would do well to reflect on the words of Revelation, chapter 6, verses 12 through 17, where it speaks regarding the return of Yeshua. "Then I watched as he broke the 6th seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black as sackcloth, and the full moon became blood red. The stars fell from heaven, just as a fig tree drops its figs when shaken by a wind. The sky receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved from its place. Then the earth's kings and the rulers and generals, rich and mighty, indeed everyone, slave and free, hid himself in caves among the rocks and in the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of the one sitting on the throne and the fury of the Lamb. For the great day of their fury has come, and who can stand?" Do we want to be able to stand and greet our Master upon his return? Or do we want to be part of those who need to hide themselves from him? The choice is ours alone, but let us also remember that on Bikkurim 30 CE, when he ascended to the Father, he was given all authority in heaven and on earth. So if we celebrate Bikkurim and the other Moedim along with Shabbat on the right day and in the right way, because we have the heartfelt desire to do so, then we'll be able to stand and greet our Master Yeshua at his return. Shabbat Shalom.